Hi, and welcome to our first chapter, chapter 1, which is an overview of what criminology is and how we're going to be looking at it using the sociological perspective. Um, so, if you haven't taken a sociology class before, and I know some of you haven't because it's not a prerequisite, understand that sociology engages with the idea or the ability to be able to kind of look deeper into things, look at things more critically. And I think when it comes to the topic of crime, this is something that as a society we could really benefit from, because we're oftentimes getting multiple messages about, what the world is like. Maybe it's via the news or social media, but oftentimes those stories or narratives that are being told aren't necessarily typical or common. We're going to understand in this course how media influences our perceptions of crime because it has a huge influence. We have to understand that underlying principles of the media, it's run on a capitalistic model, which means they're there to make as much money as they possibly can. I mean, that's their number one um, job. And of course, that's okay. But in the other sense, we know that oftentimes they will amplify, um, especially crime, because it's sensational and it gets a lot of eyeballs watching. Think about a car chase. Oftentimes, a car chase is not what is most important to you as a citizen of the United States. But the media companies absolutely know that these are the types of stories that are going to grab your attention and keep your attention until whatever happens, right? The guy gets out of the car, there's a crash, they get away, whatever it is, right? They know that those are the types of things that, kind of like a cat with a little toy, right? It will keep us going, keep us watching, and things like that. And so my hope for you this quarter is that we can really start to think about crime in the United States from a more critical lens, to understand the structural conditions, as well as how inequality plays a role. For instance, we know that certain individuals in our country will face harsher penalties than others, even though sometimes their crimes aren't as harmful to the overall, population or environment. So, um, in thinking about what I just mentioned about crime and how the media reports crime, and I know recently we've had a lot of horrible, horrible things happen, and in no way am I saying that, you know, um, school shootings aren't horrendous, that terrorism isn't, horrible, and so I want to be clear about that. All of this stuff is horrible. But the chances of it actually happening to you or me or someone in our positions are extremely rare. But it gets to us, even though I know all of this stuff, but I start to go, well, shoot, I'm in a college classroom every single day, and what if one of my students got upset or whatever, in the same ways that we've seen in the media. But overarchingly, all of this stuff is really, really rare. But the media is going to play it out and play it out. If you remember the horrible case of Sandy Hook, I think it was 2012 when Sandy Hook happened, and it was really hard. I mean, especially for me, I had a brand new baby. My child was born in 2012, and it was all these first graders who were, if you don't remember the story, it was the Adam Lanza case, and he had killed a bunch of these first graders uh, out east. Um, and so it was something that was really hard, I think, for a lot of Americans to process, especially because the victims were children. Um, but again, the stuff is really, really rare. But I noticed with that story, where I was going with this was that the major news conglomerates played that story for a month, and then there was the whole story about gun control, and I mean, and that's a pattern and a trend that we see with the terrorism too. Then they start bringing up every other school shooting that's happened, and so we start to feel like the world is a really frightening place. But in actuality, it's really not. You shouldn't be frightened because you are living in one of the safest times in the history of the United States. But I guarantee most of you are not feeling that way. And a lot of it has to do with your media consumption. We know that the more TV someone watches, ironically, the more fearful they are of crime, which isn't surprising. But kind of the twist in it is that they are least likely to be victim of crime because they are sitting on their couch, which, when you look at it from that lens, well, makes sense, right? And so that's the kind of stuff that we're going to be doing this quarter. So I kind of want to give you an overview to get started about where we are in the United States. So for one, as I mentioned, crime is down. Yes, you are living in one of the safest times in U.S. history. On the flip side of that, detention is up. So we have the highest incarceration rate in the westernized world, right? We are 5% of the world's population, but we comprise about 25% of the world's prisoners, which is about $60 billion a year. Right? So 1 in every 32 people in the United States is in our criminal justice system right now. And this comes at a very, very high cost. We're spending about $215 billion for all criminal justice. So when I gave you that $60 billion number, that was to house all of these inmates. But for everything, for the courts, for the police, it's about $215 billion a year. So this is huge. So why do we have such high incarceration rates? There are several factors that are contributing to this. The first one being length of sentencing. So throughout the last 20, 30 years, length of sentencing has increasingly gone up. So for instance, in the UK, your average drug sentence is about 6 months. In the United States, it is about 5 years, right? And I think that really goes against what most people think their sentencing will be. And that relates to a theory that we'll talk about called deterrence theory. Deterrence theory says that people will deter. They will not commit this act if they perceive the punishment will be really harsh. I mean, it makes sense, right? You're going to get your hand cut off for stealing. Oh, I'm not going to steal. Or I'm going to get a slap on the hand. Okay, I might consider that. But if you don't know what the punishment really is, or if your perceptions are completely off, then you're completely misinformed. And so you might be thinking you'll get the slap on the wrist when off with your hand kind of thing. So that's one of the factors. And tied to that are ideas such as the three strikes law, which were enacted in 1993. And in California, we've just retracted it, but I mean, it took a really long time for it to be repealed. And three strikes essentially says, you have 3 shots. On your 3rd shot, you'll be facing 25 years to life. What a lot of people don't realize, some of the flaws in the 3 strikes is that you can get 2 strikes with 1 crime. You could probably actually get 3 strikes with 1 crime, but don't quote me on that. So for instance, if you were committing a felony, you rob a liquor store or something like that, and you push somebody as you are running out of there, that would be considered assault and robbery. So 2 different charges. So it's not common, but it has happened, and there are people who are serving life without the possibility of parole in our jails in the United States for things like drugs, which, some people might say, well, hey, you had 3 chances, you blew it. But think about it. We have murderers that get out. We have rapists that get out. It really seems harsh that someone who has committed drug offenses would be held for 25 years to life. And of course, that's just a matter of perspective. So it's okay if you feel like that's okay. I'm just trying to explain why we have such high incarceration rates. Another important one in the United States is the war on drugs. So the war on drugs was started under Nixon. And this is where we really saw the increase in the prison population. It increased 12-fold. For some, as I mentioned, there were mandatory minimums. So what this means is that these are laws in which a judge or a court really can't change. So maybe I'm a judge and someone comes in and I don't know, I know a little bit about their backstory. Maybe they were a really good kid, just got caught in with the wrong crowd one day or something like that. Mandatory minimums say that I cannot take any of that into consideration, and that this person has to receive this mandatory minimum sentence without any consideration of what's going on. And that those types of rules were set up to make everything equal. And I guess that's a good start, but you can obviously see some of the problems with that as well. All right. So the course objectives or chapter objectives for chapter 1. we're going to look at how the sociological perspective can help us understand the mutual relevance of sociology and criminology. We're going to trace the rise of sociological criminology, and I'm just going to use the word criminology because they're pretty much synonymous, but there are biological ways of looking at crime. We're going to look at the relationship between crime, deviance, and criminal law. We're going to look at consensus versus conflict perspectives. We'll also be looking at some of the goals of criminal law, legal distinctions, the meanings of crimes and things like that. And then we'll touch on some of the research methods involved in crime and criminology as well. All right, so looking at criminology from the sociological lens, we're saying that there's more than just like a bad individual or a bad apple, that there's something about the ways that the society is set up that maybe rewards some and disenfranchises others. So we're not saying it's an individual problem, we're saying it's the way it's set up or structured. So we might, if we're looking at crime from a sociological lens, we might look at poverty, we might look at things like race or ethnicity. So for instance, if you look throughout American history, certain drugs have been criminalized depending on the groups that did them. So for instance, opium wasn't criminalized until the Chinese were doing it, Chinese immigrants. Same was true for Mexicans and marijuana, which is why marijuana became illegal, because early 1900s, none of these drugs were illegal. And then, of course, in the 1980s, crack was highly, highly penalized, and crack, was disproportionately done by African Americans when white upper class or middle class Americans were using powder cocaine. And so there was a major discrepancy in the ratio. You would get 100 times the amount of punishment if you were caught with crack. And really the only difference between crack and powder cocaine is water and heat. And so even today, I think the ratio is 16-1. Which means you have to have 16 times the amount of powder cocaine to get the same punishment as crack. And so, that might be an example of how we might look at this from a sociological lens. And I do think personally it's really interesting to look at crime and deviance from a psychological or a biological lens, meaning that there's something is kind of different about the individual. But the important thing with that is that it does explain some types of crimes. So for instance, many serial killers are psychopaths. And just a real basic definition of a psychopath, they don't really feel empathy. There are a lot of other characteristics. But when we look at crime and deviance from a psychological or a biological factor, it really fails to answer basic questions. So, why are crime rates different across location and time? If this was just, bad seeds or bad people, then we would, presumably see it everywhere. We'd also be interested in, why does crime differ according to key dimensions of inequality? Things like social class. We know poor people are more likely to be locked up than upper class people. A lot of that has to do with access to resources. And then we also would be interested in why certain legal responses or how certain legal responses are shaped by one's ethnicity, race, or social class. And so in this online course, we're going to be debunking some of the incorrect perceptions. So for instance, most Americans are taught that street crime is our biggest problem. But in actuality, when we get to that white-collar crime chapter, I think you're really going to be blown away by some of the inconsistencies, right? So here I think this graph really represents some of the disparities in only looking at something like a serial killer as having a psychological problem. Because if it was only based on psychology, then we should see comparable rates throughout the world, right? It's not like just a bunch of psychopaths ended up in the United States, but what is so different about the United States? And this is true for like the spree shootings and stuff as well. And there are a lot of explanations. I think quite possibly it's a combination of all of these. Oftentimes we like to just come up with one answer, Adam Lanza in the Sandy Hook case. We said, oh, he's crazy, or these guys are terrorists, or whatever it is. But we can look at it from multiple lenses. I do think that some of it has to do with the amount of guns in the United States. We have a gun for every man, woman, and child. Now, keep in mind, though, that doesn't answer everything, because Canada has a gun for every man, woman, and child, and they don't have the amount of shooting. So guns don't answer all of it, but they might answer some of it. We might look at Hollywood and the media, right? There's violence everywhere, right? It sells. People go buy tickets. It keeps us watching. But obviously, most of the rest of the world is watching, or they're watching the same types of movies we are. And so, there are all types of factors that might be contributing. So personally, after studying this for a long time, I would say it's confounding. There are many things that are contributing. But again, you can't just look at serial killing from a psychological perspective, because it can't be answered if you look at this graph. All right, so we're going to look at crime as a social phenomenon, looking at both victimization as well as who becomes the criminals. And so, first of all, you should know that the criminals are most likely to be victims as well of crime. Might go, well, how does that work out? Well, oftentimes criminals have other things that other criminals want, like money or drugs. And so, oftentimes these aren't the individuals that get the most, media publicity or whatever, but they are the ones most likely to be victims of crime. So sociology emphasizes the impact that society plays on people's behaviors and attitudes, and it really helps us understand this idea of a social phenomenon. And we also see that, since this class is really from the sociological lens, we can see a mutual relevance between criminology and sociology. Things like crime victimization and criminal justice system can't really be fully understood without appreciating kind of the structural context or the inequalities that come into play. So for instance, we might look at something like the Black Lives Matter movement. If you're looking at it from an outside perspective, maybe you're not African American or you're not in the movement, you might say something like, well, things are, equal. African Americans have just as many chances as whites or other groups. But, if we kind of peel back the layers a little bit, we can, and look at things like history, the intersection of history, as well as what's currently going on right now. We can say that, maybe they do have a reason to be upset, and that's just a matter of opinion. You don't have to agree with that. But for instance, we know that African Americans are most likely to be incarcerated, especially for things like drug offenses, when when whites do drugs actually more. We know that there are structured inequalities, things like high levels of unemployment in certain areas, really poor schools. The argument's been made that many of these schools look, very similar to prisons, and that's known as the prison to school, or the school to prison pipeline. Some of your best chances might be to either go work at McDonald's or to sell drugs. And most of us recognize that McDonald's doesn't pay very much or give a lot of status. And I think in some areas, certain individuals are socialized into those roles of drug dealers, just in the way that they grew up, or joining a gang or whatever it is. And so I've had students say things like, well, what's the difference? Why is this group so upset? And I think what some students who maybe aren't African American don't realize that there are structural inequalities that keep these people in lower positions of power. And looking at it from a historical lens, we can see obviously the long brutal history of slavery, where people were beaten, women were raped, families were torn apart. After that, you had convict lease programs, so the slaves were emancipated, but then incarcerated for mild or low-level offenses that now we would laugh at, and then leased back out to the landowners who they used to work for. We saw, Jim Crow, which was separate but equal. We obviously know things weren't equal. We saw the segregation of schools, right? And so with the movement right now, most people in the movement would say that they want accountability, because what's happened is that oftentimes if a white police officer shoots an African American, and I'm not saying this is always the case, and I'm not saying that, there aren't amazing cops out there, who are doing their job and should be respected and everything else. But it's just like any job, there are bad people within any job. And the African American community feels like there's no accountability, right? So that you can shoot a black male or black female and not face any type of punishment. And that's what's essentially, in a lot of these cases, um, the police officers are getting off and there's no real accountability. And that's why they're upset. And I think, looking at its face value, you can go, oh, okay, doesn't really look like there's anything here, but peel back the layers. Even in today's age, I have one of my sociology coworkers up here, my colleague. He's an African American male, and he talks about, I just want to keep my sons. He's got two teenage boys, and he's like, I just want to keep them alive. And so he had to have that talk about what to do when a police officer pulls you over, and keep your hands on the wheel and things like that. And that's a conversation I probably won't have to have with my child. I hope I don't. And so that's a level of privilege that I or my kid gets that his kid doesn't. And so there still are some things going on. But again, I think you really have to peel back the layers to come up with some type of understanding. I also think it's kind of a shame that the way the movement's been positioned, it's like it's cops against this movement, and I think that's a really horrible way to look at it. I mean, when you saw like Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, and of course, yeah, all lives matter, but when you say all lives matter, you are again kind of discrediting the feelings that African Americans have had for, most of American history. And so I think that's kind of a powerful thing to think about as well. All right, so hopefully you got a chance to watch the Black Lives Matter video, and hopefully it offered a little bit of understanding as to um, some of the structural conditions that people in the movement think need to be addressed. All right, so we're going to move on here. And so since we are in chapter 1, we're going to talk about some of the distinctions between concepts like crime, deviance, and delinquency. So most of you are probably somewhat familiar with these terms. They're not too new. Obviously, a crime is is a behavior that's considered so harmful that it's banned by criminal law. So anything that's against the law is considered a crime. Now, there's obviously some argument as to some of the things that we have on the books, so or inconsistencies. So, for instance, things like banning things that are harmful, like drugs. Um, and of course, yeah, most drugs are very, very harmful. But why do we still allow for cigarettes? Because cigarettes are just as harmful, and maybe perhaps even more. So even something like that. As you guys know, I live in Washington State, where we have legalized marijuana. Many people, that's kind of one that's gaining a lot of momentum in the last, 10 years, the last decade. So when it comes to who decides what is a crime, that's interesting, right? Generally, it's powerful people. And so if you know anything about how our system works, Philip Morris and all of the other cigarette companies, and they're the main one. But as you know, that they spend a lot of money to stay afloat, right? They have lobbyists. They're scratching these politicians' backs, and it's in their best interest because they want to continue to do business. So just the whole idea is that what is criminal isn't always like what's worse for you. Then we have deviance. So deviance is the idea of deviating from a norm or deviating from what most people do. So deviance is relative across time and across space. So for instance, if you kill someone during wartime, that would not be considered deviant in that social context, right? But if you, killed your wife, that would obviously be deviant and criminal, right? Um, so definitely relative across time and space. As I mentioned in a previous slide, drugs, prior to the 1900s, drugs weren't even illegal, right? We used to actually put cocaine in things like Coca-Cola, which is where it got its name. They put a little cocaine in cough drops and things like that. So kind of interesting history there. Obviously, if you go to a place like Amsterdam, or actually, well, Amsterdam or Washington, if you live where I live, you can go right down the street if you are over the age of 21 and buy marijuana, like out of, store. I don't think you can do that in California unless you have your card. So there's definitely some differences across space as well. All right, and then we have delinquency. So delinquency is any antisocial behavior mostly associated with young people. So you probably have heard the term juvenile delinquent before. Those terms kind of get put together. These are based on the ideas that young people can commit crime or commit, acts that are only criminal because of their age. Something like underage drinking, or truancy, or whatever it is. These types of behaviors are only criminal because of their age. Running away, things like that. Okay, so usually it's generally associated with failing to do what's required of a minor. So whatever it is, not going to school. Okay, so now that you know the difference between crime and deviance, we'll look at the overlap between the two. So remember, crime breaks the law. A deviant act is breaking a social norm. Deviance can actually be positive. So if I gave all of my students $100 on the first day that they walked into class, that would obviously be not normal, right? And then there are some things that are criminal that we, still do but don't really look down on as deviant. Things like jaywalking, right? Most of us will jaywalk sometime in our lives. Most of us will speed down the road, maybe download movies or, other media or something like that. That's all illegal. And so, there are some criminal acts that are actually relatively normal. And then we have this space in the middle, using my crayon here. Doesn't look very nice. Oh well. So you have this space in the middle that consume or associated with things that are both criminal and deviant. So for instance, these are the hardcore crimes, things like rape, murder, robbery. Um, Most of these are deviant and criminal in all societies. So there's definitely an overlap there. Okay, so there are certain perspectives that you can look at when engaging with some of this criminal behavior that we're talking about. So there are two different ways of looking at it. You can look at it from a consensus perspective, and the consensus perspective assumes just that most of society, we all believe that these laws are there to keep us, safe and protect us and to do the right thing. And so consensus perspectives assumes an agreement of the society, of the people in the society, right? And the reason that a lot of times we do agree is because we've internalized these norms, right? We want to be seen as upstanding citizens in our society, and we regard these norms as appropriate and necessary for, social control. On the other end, or the conflicting view, looks at the conflict perspective. Conflict perspective, on the other hand, says, no, there's not a consensus. Maybe these laws are working for some people, right? But they're not working for anyone or everyone. So conflict perspectives assumes that there's some type of disagreement or it's represented in inequality. So the idea that maybe laws are created by the powerful to keep them in power. So one that I think is really interesting, and you can look this up, is that Congress are the only people in our society who are allowed to engage legally in insider trading, right? Which is the idea that you have inside information about certain corporations or certain legislation or whatever it is that obviously our Congress people have. And so what they do is they take this information and they go play the stock market. And it's just amazing how they were able to do this. But if you or I were to do this, if we were to get some inside information, it would absolutely be considered a crime. And that's what, Martha Stewart actually got in trouble for. If you remember her, she got in trouble for insider trading, right? So, it also looks at things like maybe large corporations. One example I can think of is oftentimes when it comes to EPA regulations, so the EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency, and they are there to protect the environment, essentially. And so oftentimes what corporations will do is because they run on a cost-benefit analysis, and they'll go, well, it's cheaper for us to still let out these pollutants and just to pay the fine, right, than it would be to actually fix the pollution problem that we're emitting or whatever. But the little guy, if you look at it, on another level, the street criminal doesn't necessarily have those types of options, right? If they, let's say, graffiti a wall, you can't just pay your way out of it. And so that's some of the inconsistencies that we've seen. We'll look a lot at conflict perspective because we are, a lot of criminology is based in inequality. All right, now we're just going to go over some basic definitions so that as we progress through the lectures and things like that, I can refer to some of these ideas and you'll know what we're talking about. So the first one is the idea of crimes that are mala in se. Mala in se is the idea that these crimes are evil in themselves. Something like killing someone or raping someone or any type of violent crime or property crime, that there's something inherently evil. On the other hand, you have what's known as mala prohibita, and these are crimes that are only considered wrong because they are prohibited by law. Sometimes these crimes are known as victimless crimes. So for instance, drug use would be considered a victimless crime, and trust me, I know that that is arguable. But for the most part, it's still considered one of those. Like if you're doing it on your own, you're not affecting anyone else. Things like prostitution, right? As long as there's no coercion or exploitation, if these two people are deciding to, engage in this act together, why should it be criminal? That's, how someone from this way of looking at it would look at. Gambling would be another one. It's only really considered bad because, the government has made it illegal. But of course, things like the lottery or the, scratchers, all of those things, it's okay to do that and think about, the underlying factors. It's okay to do that because the government gets a nice big chunk of that money. So, you can see the powers that be. Even when it comes to legal prostitution, I remember years ago, and I love this angle, but some of my students were saying that, when it comes to legal prostitution or what you see in maybe certain counties in Nevada, are the idea that now instead of the woman having a pimp out on the street, it's essentially just the government, taking off a big old slice of what she's making. So kind of interesting, different perspectives and things like that. Okay, and here are some just real basic, definitions here. So a felony is a criminal offense, either punishable by death or incarceration. Felonies are generally considered more serious crimes, homicide, rape, aggravated assault, robbery, all considered felony, even burglary, things like that. So generally, if you are convicted of a felony, you will go to prison, which is the difference between prison and jail. Jail is usually held for people either awaiting to go to prison or someone whose offense isn't as serious. So if it's generally, and of course there's a lot of gray area in the law, but if you're going for over 1 year, you're going to go to prison, and generally, usually you committed a felony. If you committed a misdemeanor or a less of a severe crime, you will spend time in jail. And on the flip side here, you have your misdemeanors. So misdemeanors aren't seen as serious as felonies. And again, the punishment is generally maybe a few days jail. And keep in mind, a jail is it's a revolving door. I used to take my criminology students to LA County, and it was always really interesting. You have people who are maybe thrown in the drunk tank overnight. You have prostitutes. You have, low-level offenses. Maybe someone who did graffiti or something like that. But you also might have murderers who are waiting, their sentencing or waiting to go to prison. So it's really a mixed bag. And like I said, it's a revolving door. You have people coming in, people going out. In my experience, I really appreciate more experiencing the prisons because feel like you see more of like what's actually, they've been there for a long time. They have established norms and all different types of things that they engage with. So that's kind of just a personal thing. I think it's kind of interesting. All right, so a couple more things here. We have actus reus, which refers to the idea of the actual criminal act of which the defendant is being accused of. So this is what produces the criminal liability, and obviously you need proof that someone committed the act or commissioned the act. On the other hand, you might have what's known as omission. Crimes of omission generally involve failure to act when the law requires an individual to act. So, for instance, neglecting to do something that you were supposed to do. So, for instance, probably some people have done this, right? But failing to file your taxes, right? That is against the law. You have to file your taxes. They're probably not going to lock you up for it, but you will face a very, very hefty crime. But the main difference is crimes of commission involve an act that the law prohibits. So don't murder, rape, shoplift, things like that. Omitting is failure to act when the law requires an individual to take action. And so we also might include crimes of omission, things like child neglect, right? As a parent, you have a certain amount of responsibility. You have to take your child to school. They have to be fed, bathed, all of these things. And so failing to do something can also be, a crime. All right, so here we have mens rea, and mens rea is the state of mind that accompanies a criminal act. It's the idea of having a guilty mind, that you had the intent, that you intended to actually commit this crime. This wasn't an accident. This is what, you did this on purpose. So having that guilty mind. And there are several different ways that we can look at mens rea. So the first one is, hey, purposeful. I meant to do this. Maybe in the case of a first-degree murder, you come home, you find your spouse in bed with another person, you go and grab a gun, and you kill them. Some people would say, well, that wasn't premeditated. You just walked in. If they hadn't been in bed together, you never would have found them. But when it comes to first-degree murder, you only need a couple seconds. So if that were to happen and you took a 5-second walk down the hall to go get your gun, they can claim that that was first-degree murder and that you intended to do that. Right? Knowing, and it seems kind of simple, but knowing is the idea that you actually know that what you are doing is a crime and is against the law. And so this is where you might get a plea of insanity, right? Someone saying, well, I actually didn't know what I was doing when I walked in and killed my wife, right? And there have all been all kinds of different, ways in which people get around this or defenses. So I've heard people saying, oh, I was in a dream state when I killed my wife. So you have to be able to prove this, and it's really, really hard to prove. And even when it comes to like temporary insanity or something, it's exceedingly rare. It's really hard to get it, even if you are mentally unstable. You have to be able to prove that you did not know what you were doing at the time of the act, which is very different than actually just being having a mental deficiency or something. Another way that you can show a guilty mind is engaging in recklessness. right? So, for instance, if you get into a car to drive while you're intoxicated, that they can actually get you for first-degree murder, because they say that when you entered into the car, you knew that you could be engaging in a behavior that would end up in death or harm to somebody else. And then the last one is criminal negligence. And so this goes back to that idea of omission. So for instance, again, doing something that you were supposed to do. So when it comes to something like homicide, since that's what we're talking about, maybe it's your responsibility as a caretaker to give your ailing parent their medication every day, and you don't do that. You neglect to do that. So that's where we would what we would call criminal negligence. So just real quickly, in order to have the concurrence, which is the coexistence of both having the guilty mind and having the act. So you have the act, you have the guilty mind, you have the concurrence. So we're not saying that this was an accident. We're saying that, there was something that someone deliberately tried to do. Okay, so now we're going to engage a little bit with this idea of the guilty mind. And so this is always really interesting to me. But mens rea, or the guilty mind, does not equate to a motive. And actually, in criminal law, they don't need to prove a motive. It doesn't actually matter. It just helps explain the case, right? If you have a reason or a rationale why someone committed this crime. But think about it, right? If you killed your wife, you would you just shot her, right? So there's your guilty mind. Or let's say that you killed her because she was she was a cancer patient and she was in a horrendous amount of pain, and this is something that you have discussed with her, and this is what she would have wanted. You're still guilty in both ends, right? The motive has changed, but it doesn't matter because you've still killed your wife. And I know the first one sounds a lot worse than the second one, but that's how the law looks at it, right? You're still going to be charged for murder. Now, are they going to be harsher on the first person? Yeah, quite possibly, absolutely. In certain crimes where we know that there have been like vigilante parents, so parents who have gone after, these evil people who have done horrible things to their children. Sometimes they're still considered guilty, but maybe the judge will give them like probation or something like that, right? And so it's kind of that interesting idea that the mens rea does not equal a motive, and you don't actually have to have a motive in criminal law, but it definitely helps explain your case. All right, so now we're going to be going over some of the criminal defenses to criminal liability, or legal defenses to criminal liability. The first one is it was an accident or a mistake. I didn't need to do this. It was just a horrible mistake. I don't know, maybe you got in a car accident or something like that. Another one is ignorance. This is when criminals will say things like, I didn't know. I remember reading reports when I worked with the parolees, and there would be things like parolees saying, well, I didn't know that these pants had a bunch of cocaine in the back pocket. I borrowed these pants from my cousin, or I bought these at a Goodwill or something like that. I don't recommend ignorance as a criminal defense, but it can be used as a defense. The next one is that you were under duress or you were in fear for your own life. So maybe you're, I don't know, in a bank and there's somebody robbing the bank, and you kill someone because you're afraid that they're going to kill you first or something like that. The next one is self-defense. Self-defense is, you're defending yourself. Maybe there's a confrontation or something like that. Oftentimes self-defense is used in the case of battered women, and the judge or the jury will often look at how much force is used. I remember a case where a woman, she had stabbed her husband like 150 times and gouged out his eyeballs and cut his penis off or something like that. And obviously you can say that, it's going to be a little bit harder to claim self-defense because she went on for quite a bit of time. The next one is entrapment. So you have to understand that police are not allowed to kind of coax you into committing a criminal act. If you've ever seen a sting operation with prostitution where a police officer will dress up as a prostitute and go out on the streets to try to, get Johns to solicit her, there are a lot of rules in which she has to, engage within. So for instance, the John has to offer the money. He has to confront her. She can't go up asking, if he would like some of her services. And then lastly, you have the insanity plea. As I mentioned before, the insanity plea is very, very rare, but it is used. So one that I remember pretty distinctly was someone who got off on insanity was John Hinckley Jr., and he was the person who tried to assassinate Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And his defense was, it's kind of weird, it's crazy, right? He was obsessed with Jodie Foster, who's an actress, and he wanted to get Jodie Foster's attention by assassinating the president. So obviously we can see there's not a lot of logic happening there. So that's the end of our chapter 1. I know it's a little bit of a longer chapter, and I did try to skip through some things. So keep in mind as you take your quiz, you want to make sure that you watch all videos and print up the slides, take notes as I'm talking. Some of the questions will come straight out of the book. Some of them will only be found in the lecture, which is why it's really, really important that you are listening and reading and taking notes and making sure that you're also watching those videos that are embedded. There was only one this chapter, but there might be more in the future. So with that, thank you very much, and I will see you next chapter.